you're over here. The variability has just come completely unstuck. And that's you know, a fact of life.
The banking sector is intrinsically based on variability. That's what.
Yes.
That's their business.
That's their business. But they should totally ignore anything beyond this line. They do not have any real comprehension of anything beyond that line. Health and safety are another that tend to do that. And you know, the whole entity, you've got a complete model of risk management where they recognize that when the two planes get too close together, it can no longer be effectively controlled by the ground due to the accuracy of the radars, etc., and also due to the response times necessary for instruction to go from ground to pilot and pilot to do something. They have to switch to onboard collision avoidance. It's only by recognizing that they get hit. It was a very tragic accident almost been getting on for 10 years ago now, where a DHL plane and a plane carrying Russian school children collided just south of Switzerland. And that was totally due to one plane switching to collision avoidance and the other plane staying in ground contact. The ground controller should have released control, and the pilot in the other plane should have recognized that he was got too close for ground control and should have switched to onboard collision avoidance. And he didn't. And that's why the two collided. So you do need to change your process when you cross this boundary. Banks didn't do it. If the variability gets excessive, you must change process. You must change what you're doing. I mean, take the journey where Ned time became excessive. Now, if that happened to me, I wouldn't carry on trying to get to Portsmouth because I don't know any decent hotels around Portsmouth. But I'd probably hold up somewhere like Winchester. I changed my plan completely. I changed what I was doing, I changed my process.
Richard, we haven't all got a girlfriend in every port. Anyway, any more on that subject, or shall we move on to the next subject? Okay. Okay, do people want a break? We've only got another 20 minutes that we're allowed in here, so... You want a break?
No.
No break, right. Okay. The last subject, which is a dual subject, is risks and issues and ownership, but we'll do the definition first because it seems silly to do the ownership without defining them. And again, the PPM students will, I hope, all have this one very clearly in their heads. Now, the PMBOK and all the standards and prints and so on, they all say an issue is something that's happened that wasn't in the plan, so you have to react to it. Effectively, it's crisis management. I mean, they call it issue management. Crisis management is just a big one. And a risk is something that hasn't happened yet. Okay? So a high risk is a 90% chance of it happening. An issue has happened. It's in the past tense. Clearly a risk can't be in the past tense. Ned says he disagrees. And it's important, if Ned convinces you, remember when you talk to other people, you mention issue and risk, they'll be on the PMBOK definition in their heads, unless you explain it. So, right? But in my experience, watching project managers, and indeed lots of people in lots of circumstances, people actually act at a point where they believe this is going to happen. If you believe it's going to rain, you carry your raincoat and your umbrella. It hasn't started to rain yet. Okay? So if you think something is going to go wrong, you better start planning for it to go wrong. In other words, Ned would say, if anything is more than 50% likely, you better plan for it, because you think it's going to happen. Okay? Call it an issue. An issue is something that needs action now. As soon as we really believe it's going to rain, we get the raincoat. We don't actually wait till you start to rain. Till it starts to rain. This, of course, means that if you classify all high risks as issues, you better plan for them. Then the risk register ends up with only risks that are 50% likely or less. Okay? And the word issue includes lots of risks that, according to the English Dictionary definition, are risks. They haven't happened yet. And they still might not happen, but we believe there's more than a 50-50 chance. So Ned argues that risks and issues all belong in the issue register when the risk is big enough, and what's left is only, perhaps you should call them concerns instead of risks, because it's only half the risks. I'm not too concerned with the terminology. So that's Ned's definition. Do you want to...
I think we ought to stick on definition first and then come back to ownership.
That's right.
I would say here that Ned is almost right.
Great.
And the APM is totally right. Even though Ned doesn't agree with the APM. And the APM wouldn't agree with Ned. Why are they both right? Well, we've got to come back to this, the dear old circle. The APM says, look, we have a risk impact and we have a contingency plan which puts it right, perhaps. And if it doesn't put it right, we end up with an issue. Ned says that an issue is a fact which is going to give us a problem. So effectively, an issue is a precursor to risk. It's actually one and the same thing. The only difference is the APM's thinking follows the natural flow of risk in a clockwise direction and only thinks, well, the risk is impacted, I haven't totally solved it, I'm left with an issue. And Ned is trying to be proactive and manage the risk and keep it back as an issue. So Ned's use of the word issue is proactive in risk management, and the APM's use of the word issue is totally reactive to a risk impact you can't totally resolve, and therefore you're left with an issue. So the two are actually the same thing, they're just viewed from a different perspective. Now I said Ned was almost right. I don't agree with Ned's pedantic 50%. Basically, because I don't think our ability to estimate probabilities is that good. And particularly when I went along to an organisation after Ned had been there to find a vast number of risks with a probability of 49%. Not amusing. My attitude is we're probably talking, if it gets over kind of 65–70%, I would expect you to be handling it as an issue. Because by the time you get to that level, it is definitely more likely to happen than not. But I've got two other tests for issues. One which I very rarely see applied but which usually gets rid of an awful lot of risks. And that is my challenge. What is the value of taking that risk? So often I see risks in the register and I say, why is it there? What is the value? What benefit are we getting by taking this risk? What opportunity, what benefit are we trying to access? And the usual thing is nothing. In the lecture this afternoon, and you'll no doubt get it again when I do PPS in the future, I ask about the value of not having a stock control system in a restaurant. If you don't have a stock control system, sooner or later you're going to serve somebody bad food. That loses you reputation, compensation to the client, may get you to the notice of the local health inspector, and once you're in some legal body's hands, life gets tough. There's an awful big downside and no upside to be achieved. So, if there's no value in taking the risk, it's an issue to get rid of it. And then there's those risks where the downside is unacceptable. Now, it may be that the cost is unacceptable, the delay it would cause is unacceptable, or it may be that from a particular cause, when you sum up all the impacts that could possibly come from that cause, that is unacceptable, so you should make it an issue to resolve that cause. Equally, if it's outside your skill set, it's an issue. So if it's a health and safety risk, it's an issue for a project manager, because he needs to hand it to somebody who has experience and competence in health and safety risk. Mostly because health and safety risk is knowing and understanding and applying vast volumes of legislation that the average project manager basically probably has enough time to read the abstract and certainly not the acts. So if it requires specialist skill, it becomes an issue and you should be handing it back. So there are more things than just probability which defines whether something should be an issue. And as I said, the only disagreement between Ned and I is probably about that level of probability. But the most important one I'll come back to, and that is the APM idea of an issue, and Ned's idea is actually about the same thing. It's just that Ned looks at it proactively as a risk manager, trying to push the risk back to issues, get them resolved, and get them taken out of the picture altogether. The APM's attitude is to let the whole thing drift round and be left with an issue when basically the whole risk impact has expired and what you're left with is an issue.
Okay, yeah, I'm not going to argue with 10%, 65%, whatever, and I do agree that if something is unacceptable, you know, if a potential nuclear disaster or something, you know, it's an issue, even though the probability is minuscule. It's unacceptable, so we agree on that one. With the 49%, by the way, don't blame me. I'd never let anybody put down 49% because I don't believe anybody knows that accurately.
No.
And
I didn't blame you, it's just after your lecture to them, I went in afterwards and they downgrade all their risks to 49%.
The important point is that any given risk should either be classed as a risk or an issue. And the big danger is double accounting. And having somebody dealing with it in the risk list and somebody else dealing with the same thing in the issue list, and then you get true confusion. And before we leave this subject, I'd like to give you an example that I think illustrates what I'm trying to say. Last year's risk group, you know the new building at the end, at the end of the water down there, yeah? There's a new building acrosswards, a second IT building or whatever they call it. That was built last year, and it was in construction around about this time of year, and the risk group, one of the risk group arranged for the risk group to go and visit the university's project manager, who was looking after the contract and chasing the contractor and so on. And it was most impressive. He had a very nice, well-documented project plan and a risk plan, and he was able to show us. and an issue list. The interesting thing was, I said, what's your biggest issue at the moment? I think it was about March or April. His issue was that they should have, the contractor was responsible for getting a certification regarding the insulation of the building and the loss of heat for their green, you know, the government's green targets and so on. And this certificate should have been stamped and sealed by the end of February. It hadn't been done. They'd gone all the way through March. He'd been nagging it.